Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. Given that this is spring break for many of you that are in the United States, we're also going to give the podcast a little bit of a break this week, so we're taking a little bit of time off. We didn't want to leave you without an episode. So what we thought we would do is we would actually dip back into the archives and pick up one of our earlier episodes that some of our newer listeners might not have been able to listen to. So today we're going to revisit one of my episodes that we did in the past. It's actually episode 22 that was released in October of 2019. And give that to you today just as a refresher about some of the early days of the podcast and maybe a topic that might be of interest to you as well. I'm happy to report that we have a number of new episodes that are in the works. We've been teasing some of those here of late with some new guests, certainly some new topics that come as listener suggestions, and I'm really excited over some of the things that we have in the works that'll be our release schedule over the next couple of months and the role that our listeners have had in that. But in the interim today, hope that you enjoy episode 22, No Parking. Thanks.
Don Alexis, taking just a quick break from the podcast today to not pitch you something, not try to quote-unquote sell you something, but ask you to do something for us if you would. So, have you ever gone to a restaurant or something, Alexis, that was just absolutely fantastic?
Yes.
What did you do?
Left a review.
Left a review, or you told somebody about it,
Yep.
right? Well, in the nature of the world of podcasting, there's a number of different ways to do that. Most of you get this podcast probably not directly from the organization where we publish it and host it. Some of you may directly link to our Buzzsprout feed there, and there's value to doing that, and we think you should do that because you're going to get it directly. But most of you probably get it through what's known as a podcast
Catcher,
a podcatcher, an aggregator. The two most common of those, probably one of the two most famous, are probably Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts.
Yep.
Because the world, particularly the mobile device world, is divided between
Apple and Google.
But there are a number of different other ones. Stitcher, and there's a number of different podcatchers. You probably have, most of you we know from the statistics that we see, listen to our podcast on a mobile device, and you listen to that through some form of application that does that. Many of those applications and many of the places where you get those podcasts allow you to do two important things. They both begin with an R. What are they, Lex?
Rate and review.
Okay, so what is the value for us getting ratings and reviews?
So, particularly in those podcast aggregators, catchers, whatever you want to call them, is the more ratings and reviews you get when you have somebody that's coming to that app and is just searching for a specific topic, your podcast is going to float to the top.
Right, and so it helps us in the search engines.
Yes.
Which allows us to be found a little bit easier. The other thing is, if somebody encounters our podcast and they're maybe intrigued by the description, but they don't know if they really want to listen to it or not, we all do this when we find something. We look for
Ratings and reviews.
And so if somebody says this is great, or somebody says this is horrible, or you see that the vast majority of them are 5-star reviews, you're more inclined to give it a test. If you see no reviews, what are you inclined to do potentially?
Pass it up.
Pass it over. And so it really does help the podcast a lot if you take the time to deliver a rating or review. I have to say, because I've gone and tried to do this and do it for other podcasts, it's not always easy to do because you actually have to do some work. But if you would do that, we certainly would appreciate it. Even if that's a negative review, we certainly prefer the 5-star ratings and positive reviews. But it's helpful and it's valuable to us if you would do that. So what do we want to encourage our listeners to do, Lex?
Go on your podcast catcher of choice and rate and review.
And so they just grabbed defeat from the greatest victory in the computer industry. Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry today. Could have been, a company 10 times its size. Could have been IBM. Could have been the IBM of the 90s. Could have been the Microsoft of the 90s.
The voice that you just heard, familiar to so many, that of the late legendary co-founder of Apple computers, Steve Jobs. That particular audio clip from a television documentary that was shot in the mid-1990s. And the subject that Jobs is speaking on for that particular audio clip relates to a very interesting event in the history, the modern history of computers and the history of the information age and business. So much of what we understand today actually pivots around what he's talking about there. And that's what we're going to be exploring today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. I'm Don Shelley, your host. Our episode today is going to be about what would have happened if Xerox, most of us know Xerox as the legendary copier company, but what would have happened if Xerox had taken advantage of and capitalized on the position that they held in the late 1970s as the result of a unique thing that they had created in California called the Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, P-A-R-C for short. And so today we're going to be looking at a little bit about the history of PARC and how much of what we know about modern computers, much of what we know about the computer age, the things that we interact with every day, flow from what happened at the Palo Alto Research Center. But we're talking about how most of those devices and most of the things that we work with don't bear the name of Xerox, even though Xerox founded PARC and had the resources of PARC at its disposal. So today here on the podcast, we'll be exploring the alternate path of what if Xerox had taken advantage of what they had at the Palo Alto Research Center. So as we often do here on the podcast, we often need to explore the what did before we explore the what if. And obviously the what did begins with an understanding about what was the Palo Alto Research Center, how did it come into existence, what was PARC all about, and then it's much easier for us to understand what Xerox could have been. It's important to set the stage. We're in the late 1960s. Now Xerox had invented the copying industry sort of as we know it in the 20 years previous to that, and had come to grow to have a dominant position in the copier world. In fact, so much so that to many people of that generation, even my generation, which is a little bit after that, would refer to making a photocopy of something as making a quote-unquote Xerox of it. You know that you own the space very well when your company name is synonymous with just the process that others are able to do. But an interesting thing was happening in the photocopier business, which Xerox had grown to dominate, particularly in that day. It's not the photocopier that we think of today, which is part of or function inside of every desktop printer that we have in our home or in our office, or that we can easily have access to almost anywhere on demand. Printers and copiers were big business machines, and particularly the photocopiers were very large, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some instances for large corporations, for high volume copiers at that time. And so it was a very lucrative business. It was very important to the operation of business, and Xerox again had the dominant place. The problem was, as they were drawing towards the end of the 1960s and moving towards 1970, was that the patents that they had on the technology which had allowed them to achieve that dominance in the copier world were drawing to an end. And they were facing pressure, tremendous amounts of pressure, particularly from Asian manufacturers who were making copy machines much cheaper and were able to compete where Xerox no longer had the absolute capability of dominating the market because they held a patented technology. And so Xerox, realizing that they were vulnerable to a change in the marketplace and a change in the economics at that time, realized that they needed to evolve as a company in order to be able to continue to be a company the size that they were. And again, they're one of the largest companies in the world with one of the most dominant market capitalizations and market positions. And so they found, with their chief scientist, a gentleman by the name of Jack Goldman, a research center that they found in Palo Alto, California, hence Palo Alto Research Center. And so it's there on the West Coast, and it is far removed from where Xerox corporate offices are, which is in Rochester, New York. So it's about 3,000 miles away on an entirely different coast of the United States, very near a number of institutions, not far from Stanford, not far from other technical institutions in California, near where there's a lot of concentration for things that support the burgeoning space program at the time. And so they create PARC intentionally for one thing, and that's to seek out new technologies that they can gain a commercial benefit in. And so with the expiration of their copier patents, they were looking to find other technologies that would allow them to transition and continue to be a dominant technology company. When you think about that, there's other similar things that can be experienced or thought about in the business world. In some ways, PARC was almost like, if you think to the aviation industry, particularly the military aviation industry, like a skunk works. It was a place that was set up to be entirely different than what its corporate entity was all about. And to say that the Palo Alto Research Center, to say that PARC was a success in terms of accomplishing the goal of being an incubator of thought and of new technology is really an understatement. Many who are in technology today sort of consider PARC to be the prime example of many things that we think of today when we think of quote-unquote tech companies. If you think of folks in sort of unconventional office spaces, sitting on beanbag chairs, dressing casually, not following a suit and tie sort of corporate America, what you've described there, of course, describes almost every .com or every technology company for the last 20, 30, 40 years, but it was sort of started with the concept of what was going on at PARC. They had beanbag chairs. And so many of the later technology companies and technology startups would flow from having seen even just the way things were done at PARC in terms of the atmosphere physically, in terms of how the office was constructed, how people were allowed to work, sort of free expression in the workplace. That also sort of flows from what was there at Xerox PARC. What's important to note is that was very different, though, than the culture that existed for corporate Xerox. And that's actually a great important part of the story, is sort of the clash of cultures that existed between traditional Xerox, the company that had grown to be the dominating force in the copier world, and what they had created. Again, what they had created on the West Coast in the Palo Alto Research Center that was intentionally designed to carry them to the next area of success in technology. And so the story that we're going to tell today, and the alternate path of history that we're going to go down, looks at what flowed out of PARC but did not come to the benefit of Xerox. So let's talk about some of the things that came out of Xerox PARC. As I record the podcast here, I'm using a personal computer. That personal computer sits here in front of me, and I'm interacting with the controls of the program that I use using what's on the screen is a graphical user interface. I can see, for example, as I'm recording here, I can see the WAV files being recorded. I can see a visual representation of the tracks that are being recorded, and when mixing and editing happens later, that's all done in a visual environment. That's a graphical user interface, what we know as being Windows, or if you go back to the days of Macintosh, one of the first computers to heavily use a graphical user interface. What you see is a virtual desktop, and you are able to interact with the computer in the form of pictures and graphical representations. The user interface involves graphics. If you're old enough to remember to go back to the early days of computing, it wasn't always this way. Computers used keyboards, and they used commands that you typed in, and it wasn't a point and click type of world. It wasn't a graphical user interface type of world. It was very much letters in the form of text on a visual screen, a display, and a keyboard was the mode of interaction. The graphical user interface, the computer that we know today, changed all of that. To interact with that graphical user interface, most of us don't use a keyboard. Most of us use a pointing device of some type, which we call a mouse. And that mouse is something that allows you to easily interact with that graphical user interface. So obviously Windows and the graphical user interface, the mouse, it's hard to imagine computing today without those things. Those were innovations that came out of Xerox PARC. Those were things that saw their roots, saw their development at Xerox PARC. As I'm recording this podcast, and then we'll transmit it up so that it can actually reach you at some point. I'm actually going to do that over a computer network. That can be a local network that I'm connected to, which is a way that computers that communicate inside of an office, that's mostly wireless now, but still is often wired over something called Ethernet. If you extend out to the internet is not exactly Ethernet, but it's still using that networked communication technology that allow computers over distances, be they short or be they far apart, to talk to each other. So the idea of networking computers together, in fact, the internet is a vast global network of computers and information and data that's stored. That concept of being able to network computers together, what we know as Ethernet, also came out of Xerox PARC. So just those few small things that are there, if you think back to the graphical user interface, the mouse, if you think back to networking computers together, again, what we think of as being modern computer technology was something that was the result of the innovations which happened there at the Palo Alto Research Center. So again, the story of PARC is that Xerox intentionally created this place, as I was describing earlier, to find new technologies. The technologies I just described were definitely new technologies, impactful technologies. They still have impacted all the way down till today. And so the question remains is, why didn't Xerox capitalize on those technologies, and how might have history been different? Again, if we go down the what did path, what did actually happen in history, the most notable thing was, even though Xerox had created this unique technology innovation incubator 3,000 miles away, they didn't fully understand how to take what they had there and turn it into something that was marketable. In fact, when you hear interviews and when you hear the stories of those who worked at PARC, what you'll often hear is the expression of frustration about all of these things that they were creating and doing that were so innovative, and they grasped and understood how innovative they were, how they were attracting other innovators there to PARC. And yet when corporate representatives would come out from New York to visit PARC and they would show them what they were developing, very often there were blank stares, or there was an obvious lack of understanding about what to do with this technology. Now, part of that, in fairness to those executives that were coming out from Mother Xerox there in Rochester, New York, was these are technologies that we look at today and we take for granted and assume that, well, of course, these make perfect sense. They were revolutionary, though, at that time. The people that were coming had never seen or interacted with a personal computer. They didn't fully grasp even the power of what the first personal computers would be able to do in the business world before graphical user interfaces or mice or networking became so prevalent. They were looking at things that were just beyond, in some cases, just beyond their comprehension in terms of the raw technology itself, let alone being able to actually understand how that would be applied or used. Although it is interesting, and I'll include the link in the show notes, there's an interesting, essentially a commercial, sort of a demonstration of one of the first personal computers, because again, one of the first things that's built there at PARC that Xerox does not take advantage of was one of the first computers, the Alto computer. And what you'll see if you follow that link and look at the YouTube video is an explanation of what it's like for someone to come into their office and interact with this Alto computer that is on their desk, that is using things like email. What you see is what you get: word processing, being able to print to will be a precursor of the modern laser printer, to be able to interact with other computers that are there, part of the network, in terms of forwarding on an email or sending files or sharing information. It's this very brief video that sort of gives a 2 to 3 minute overview, and it was actually created both as an external way of describing what the folks there at PARC had developed and sort of the vision that they saw of the future, but it was also intentionally created to sort of explain to their corporate sponsors, those that were back at the main Xerox, about what this would look like into the future. In other words, what would an office look like in the future, beginning to move towards the idea that we think of today as being perhaps the paperless office. And I think that's probably the most notable thing when you try to defend how Xerox could miss this wonderful opportunity that it had. Is here's a company that is literally built on copying and proliferating paper and printing on paper, who is being asked to grasp what a future office might look like where things might be paperless and the interactions may take place on a screen versus taking place on copies that have to be generated. And of course, if you're a Xerox executive, you're thinking about those copies and the printing happening on Xerox machines, Xerox technology that clients have spent tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in those day dollars. Again, we're talking about 1960s, 1970s dollars to have inside of their infrastructure. And so one of the tensions that exists between Xerox and the Palo Alto Research Center is just over getting the folks at corporate Xerox to understand what they were sitting on. So Xerox, because of that lack of understanding, not quite fully grasping how to turn what they had in terms of thought and innovation into something that can be commercialized, ends up not taking advantage of a lot of what they have and is built over roughly the first 10 years of PARC. The period from around 1970 through the late 1970s is when PARC is at its most innovative high, and so many of the things that we've described here come out of that. While they don't grasp and understand what's going on there are folks that do. And the folks that do are the burgeoning personal computer business, and that's where Steve Jobs and eventually Bill Gates will come into play, as Apple, to some degree, is the first company that is successful with producing the first, what we think of as the modern personal computer, the Apple II. And so in the mid to late 1970s, Apple is the coming rising technology company in the Silicon Valley out in California, and we're starting to see the concept and folks getting the grasp of what can be done with a personal computer. As primitive and compared to what we think of today as the first Apples were, they were powerful compared to what people had available in terms of typewriters or in terms of the ability, for example, to do spreadsheets or other important applications that we just think of as being everyday extensions of everything that we do in the business world today. So the Apple II comes onto the scene and the personal computing age is born. It doesn't take long before other companies come along seeing Apple's success, including IBM and others who come along looking to create their versions of personal computers. And so beginning in the late 70s and into the early part of the 1980s, we have the computer wars that go on between Apple on one side and IBM and the various companies that were making IBM compatible type machines. It's before that competition really starts taking place that an interesting thing happens. And the interesting thing that happens is Xerox is actually interested in getting into the game with Apple, and they're interested in seeing what Apple might be able to do with some of their technology. And to do that, they actually are interested in getting stock in Apple. And so they have, through a series of business negotiations, the opportunity to get in on Apple's IPO and to get 1 million shares worth of Apple at a very sweet price, something that's going to be very profitable to the company. However, the price for that ends up being, in exchange for that, is that Apple Computers asks for a chance to come and tour the Palo Alto Research Center and talk to the folks that are there, because they've heard stories and have seen glimpses that have slipped out into the public space about what's going on at the Palo Alto Research Center. And so there's a legendary event in the late 70s, which is the event that Steve Jobs is sort of indirectly referring to in that the quote that we started the podcast with, where he and others from Apple actually go and see what's going on at Xerox PARC. Better for him to explain what he saw that day and for me, so here's another clip from Steve.
And they showed me really 3 things. But I was so blinded by the first one that I didn't even really see the other 2. One of the things they showed me was object-oriented programming. They showed me that, but I didn't even see that. The other one they showed me was really a networked computer system. They had over 100 Alto computers, all networked, using email, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't even see that. I was so blinded by the first thing they showed me, which was the graphical user interface. I thought it was the best thing I had ever seen in my life. Now, remember, it was very flawed. What we saw was incomplete. They'd done a bunch of things wrong, but we didn't know that at the time. It's still, though, they had the germ of the idea was there, and they'd done it very well. And within, 10 minutes, it was obvious to me that all computers would work like this someday.
To me, the last part of that quote is the most telling part. As I described before, very often what you hear described by the folks that were there at Xerox PARC is that when the executives would visit from New York, they wouldn't grasp what they had and the benefits of what they were going to be able to do with the technology and the innovation that they had created. And there you hear, perhaps it's easy to say this after the fact, but those who were there in the room and who were aware of what happened will tell you that probably was the case, that Jobs, who had a different understanding and a different vision about how things could work, immediately grasped what he was seeing and how it would revolutionize the computer industry. That's the reason today that you see computers and other devices that bear the Apple logo instead of the Xerox logo. So the story that goes from that point forward is that Jobs takes that information back to his team. He actually is able to sort of walk away with some of the code and even some of the concepts there from the visit to PARC. And he's able to go back to his team, which is working on the next generation Apple computer to follow the Apple II, which is the Lisa. And immediately they start revamping what that computer is going to be. The end result of what they will produce is legendary in terms of what it meant for the computer industry, and that's the Macintosh in 1984, which was the first computer to really turn the idea of what computing was on its head and use the graphical user interface, use the mouse, use so many of the things that we are now so familiar with. IBM and IBM type computers would follow as a result of Microsoft's foray into also producing a graphical user interface that we know as Windows, into bringing that same technology to computers that were other than Apple computers. And so today, while it's certainly possible to use computers that do things in a text-based format, and you can still get to a DOS prompt or a C prompt in order to be able to input commands directly, the way that all of us utilize the computers that we use today is through a graphical user interface and a mouse. And so that was what turned into Jobs' original quote there, saying they could have been the Apple, they could have been the Microsoft, talking about Xerox, if they had taken advantage of what they had. So let's go down the historical what if. What if Xerox had someone like a Steve Jobs that was in their organization, or they would have been able to convince the powers that be from corporate in New York that they had something that could be operationalized and could be made commercial? How might things have been different? Well, there's a couple of different areas that we can explore, and we'll begin to do that now. Probably the most notable likely change if Xerox had been the company that was moving and shaking with this technology would have been how much earlier the adaptation and the adoption of the computer into the business workplace in terms of the personal computer would have been. Certainly computers existed in corporate America. They existed in the form of mainframes, IBM's, AS400s. Computers were not foreign to the business world, but the way that Xerox at PARC, the Xerox PARC folks envisioned the Alto working in the business environment of the future is very similar to the way that the computer does work today. They had a very accurate vision of the future, the vision that Jobs was able to see and was able to put into play once he saw those technologies at hand, and others then began to copy and try to innovate. So imagine a scenario where instead of the graphical user interface and the personal computer becoming something that is growing through the 80s and into the early 90s, that process actually begins in the early 70s with the backing of an organization in the form of Xerox that already has market penetration and a great deal going on in the office space. It would be an extension of what they're doing, the way that they can network and connect that to what the copiers and printers, the paper technology in terms of supporting that, now being supported by the digital technology much earlier would have been an interesting thing to see. So imagine the office that we grew accustomed to, let's say by 1990, was the office of 1981 or 1982. While that may not seem like a big difference in terms of looking at 8 to 10 years earlier, 8 to 10 years in the development of computer technology and how it impacts business is a very substantial period of time. As we're sitting here recording this podcast in late 2019, we're just past the 10-year anniversary of the first smartphone in the case of the iPhone. Think about just how much that has changed the way that technology has worked in the personal communication space in the last 10 years. A lot can happen in 10 years, and so a 10-year head start on the growth and input into the personal computer on the desktop at work, and then obviously how that would permeate over to the home environment, could have made a tremendous difference. Probably the second most notable thing actually relates to that same concept, to the same example that I just gave, which is how Apple, taking advantage of its position in the personal computer space that came to be as a result of utilizing the technology and the capabilities that they obtained from PARC and from PARC's research, and then of course others, the Windows movement following behind that. So the IBM world also had a graphical user interface. But in the case of Apple, they then transferred that technology and that leading technology away from computers. And so if you think about the things that Apple is known for today, yes, certainly they still sell computers, they still make computers, there's still software involved in what they do, but by far their largest revenue source is the iPhone today. And that revenue source translates over into services. So for example, the iPhone and its capabilities of through apps and through music that can be played in the iTunes interface, where the iPod, again, an Apple innovation, is now part of and built into what goes on inside of a smartphone. All of these things working together, so now it's not just the device and the hardware, which is what initially graphical user interfaces and the things that Jobs saw that he was able to convert and take from Xerox that came to Apple, but then things morphed into the types of things that now produce revenue as a result of services. So again, looking back to how things might have been different for Xerox if they had taken advantage of what's there. Again, when Jobs says they could have been the Apple or they could have been the Microsoft of the 90s, that means the things that go with that are in the area of revenue that's derived from services, that are derived from the things that are not just the devices themselves and what they can do with the additional business opportunities that are there. Again, remember that eventually, while IBM did have a place in the business world, even in the computing world, eventually they don't hold the same space even today that they once did in terms of when computing was a mainframe scenario inside of a business operation. Apple displaced part of that with the personal computer revolution, decentralizing computing away from the mainframe, which had been IBM's mainstay. So imagine that Xerox is able to use its technology and its place in the marketplace because of their copier existence, and now what they have with the Alto, and Xerox being the purveyor of the first personal computer in the business environment, how they would have leveraged that with their copier business, and how that would have been even more of a blow to IBM. Apple and IBM went back and forth. Apple didn't have the resources initially that a Xerox would have had, and so a Xerox coming with the technology and the mindset and the vision that eventually became Apple's vision would have been a much scarier proposition to IBM and others in the business world. And so while he talks about Xerox being the Microsoft of the 90s or the Apple of the 90s, that is perhaps even an understatement in terms of how we think about those, because they would have been starting from the place of where Xerox was as their starting point, not starting essentially from ground zero, which is where Apple found itself, or even IBM when it moved into the personal computer business, was starting from a very different mindset. It was having to undermine its mainframe business in order to go into the personal computer business, which was a very different model, a very different paradigm. And so one of the things that would have happened with a Xerox moving forward with the capabilities that it had with PARC is that it might have even accelerated even faster what Apple was able to do, and then IBM and others came and followed behind, were able to do, because they would have started already from a place that would have been above ground. It would have been a positive starting point. Finally, the last potential alternative down a historical timeline where Xerox is the more savvy personal computer, Apple-esque, Microsoft-esque company, is realizing that there probably would also be another company that would be out there that might have come into being because of the difference in timing that would have been its competitor. One of the ways to think about, for example, the way that Apple is competed against today is from internet-based, from cloud-based solutions. So, for example, Google wins the search engine wars and now provides things like Google Docs and has a Chrome operating system and other types of things that enable them to be a competitor to what used to be the physical computer or the software that ran on the physical computer. In other words, it's possible to use Google Docs as your word processor day in a hosted environment as something that's provided by Google that's an alternative to Apple or to Microsoft or any of the other companies that are out there. And so what inevitably happens through innovation is that there's the logical things that you can predict from innovation, but then there's disruptive technologies and responses to that innovation which are developed. Again, if we start the whole timeline, again, let's say roughly 10 years earlier with a much stronger company in terms of financial capabilities and in terms of market penetration that exists in terms of Xerox, moving in obviously the place that they would logically go, which is in a business space. That's the very reason they created PARC, was to develop innovations that they could use to continue to be a dominant company in the space of business technology. Imagine that, sometime in the 80s or the 90s, perhaps it's in the form of the internet, or perhaps it's in the form of something that we don't even imagine or understand today. Something comes along that works to counter that. And so what does the 1990 version of a Google challenging now the dominance of a Xerox come into play? Or even thinking about the way that Apple, because of what it was able to do through personal computers, and in fact the very ad that launched the Macintosh, the famous Super Bowl ad from 1984, is taking a play on going against IBM as if they are big brother. It's the established corporate environment, Apple sort of being the David that's taking on Goliath. Somebody, perhaps it's an Apple or somebody else, might have been taking on the Xerox. And the result of that competition is innovation and changes in what's there. So while I think it's easy in the early part of thinking about an alternative timeline where Xerox proceeds forward and puts the things that they have in PARC into action in the 70s and the 80s and are continuing that domination into the 90s, most definitely there would have been the response back to that from someone else. And so we would have seen a different form of innovation taking place again earlier. And the competition that comes from that scenario and its impact on innovation would have driven perhaps innovations that we don't even know today. Again, for me, that 10-year head start in technology back in the 70s may translate to being 15 to 20 years difference now in terms of where things might be in terms of the development, just because of the way that technology accelerates and how time frames work. And so it translates into, we could be using what we will come to know, and we may not even know exactly what it looks like today, 2035's technology here in 2019, because we began using 1990s technology in 1982 because of Xerox bringing that technology forward and having it have an impact not only in the business world but in general in the technology world and in society as a whole. So sort of in conclusion, I guess one way of thinking about how the world might be different is you might be sitting in your home right now looking at your 15-year-old X phone, the Xerox derivative that would have come in place of the iPhone, and you'd be contemplating using communication technology X, which I don't even imagine what that is because it's ahead of where we are now if we had gone down a different path and started that path earlier. There's also little or no doubt that one of the most notable other differences that would exist if Xerox had been the Xerox that it wasn't. One only needs to look at the companies that are largest in the world by market capitalization, in other words, the value of their stock. The largest companies in the world in that category, the number one and the number two, are Microsoft and Apple, and collectively they're worth somewhere close to a little over $2 trillion, trillion with a TR. And so it's very easy to see that Xerox would be a very different company if it had held the position in terms of the value of the stock that we currently see from Microsoft and Apple, both of which are the beneficiaries again of the developments that happened at Xerox PARC that Xerox did not take advantage of. On the other end of the spectrum, as we draw here towards the latter part of the second decade in the 21st century, Xerox has virtually ceased to exist as a company. It's primarily been sold off into various parts or various components, and the remaining elements of the company have been sold to a Japanese firm, in this case Fuji, to take over their interests and to take over some of their technologies and for the company to be what it is now. And so the two different paths, the Xerox in the real world, in the what did versus the Xerox in the what if the Xerox and the what if were somehow a combination or even somehow in the neighborhood of a Microsoft or an Apple in terms of their global economic dominance, that would be very different from a company that essentially no longer exists and has now been totally consumed and purchased by a foreign rival in the case of Fuji. And so the primary difference that we could see would be a Xerox that would still exist today versus a Xerox that is no more. So thanks for joining us here on this episode of A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Just invite you to visit our website. If you get a chance, you can give us feedback there, and we certainly would welcome you interacting with us. You'd find us at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Options there to give us feedback on episodes, to make topical suggestions, support the podcast by connecting over to our Patreon page, and even can give us feedback in the form of our listener survey, particularly if you're a long-standing listener for the podcast. If 5 months constitutes a long-standing period, we'd certainly love to have feedback from you. We've asked for this a number of times. Very brief listener survey exists there on the website that you can access on every page of the site. So again, we appreciate your time today, appreciate you being part of the community that we've built here at A Fork in Time. And until next time, this is Don Shelley, your host, signing off. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Join us next time.